I'd like to take a moment of your time before the video starts to ask you if you like the content of my channel. I try to keep it as diverse as I can and cover a wide base of topic areas. Please subscribe, okay? Hit the subscribe button. And also with all of this weapons testing and proving out, any support you can give will help me in my endeavors and my future projects. And you can send your support. My one goal was to get $1 from every subscriber a month through Patreon. That hasn't worked out well. And down in the description box is a link to the Patreon site where you can sign up for a monthly support donation. Or if you don't like that and just want to send some support, a one-time deal, there's also a link to a PayPal pool where you can also send support. And any support you send me will be deeply appreciated and help me to continue keeping the content of my channel diversified. Thank you. The United States M1911-A1 .45 caliber pistol. I'm going to do a little video here. I'm going to be reviewing a few of these guns, but in this video we're going to talk about the history of the pistol, some facts, fiction, and maybe tell you a few sea stories and tall tales about these guns in use over the, I think it was 80 some years of service at these, or 70 or 80 years of service until they were replaced with the Beretta M9. So let me get started and I'll get the camera set up. I'll take a look at the gun in question. In the early part of the 20th century, the United States Army decided it was going to look for a new pistol. Ran different trials. The Luger was involved and a number of different handguns. They were not quite satisfied with the .38 caliber revolvers that they adopted in the 1890s. After going through a series of trials and tests, the Ordnance Board decided that the pistol should be no less than .45 caliber. So in the end, you only had two guns that showed up, designed by John Browning and a Savage made, which is basically a scaled up Savage model 1907 with the little 32s and that in .45 ACP. Ended up being the only two pistols to get that far. In the testing, John Browning's design come out as the winner and was adopted in 1911, henceforth the name Model 1911. The United States Navy and Marine Corps, I think, adopted the pistol as their official pistol in 1913. Even though this pistol was the standard issue pistol, at the beginning of World War I, they only had about 68,000 pistols in inventory, and of course other handguns were used as secondary weapons because they could not produce enough of them for their needs for the war. And there were several manufacturers contracted. Some did produce the pistols. I believe Remington did, but there were several other companies. They're in the historical list there, but some of them never got anything produced. The contracts were canceled by the time the war ended. So in 1924, the Army decided to make some changes. Now the difference between the Model 1911 is on this back strap here, you see this has got like a hump. The early 1911 was straight. They put this different back strap on to give you a good grip. They made this little beaver tail thing here on the grip safety a little longer, and they also went and cut these scallops out on both sides of the receiver by the trigger here, this little cutout, to allow you to get a better position of your trigger finger on the trigger. and then it became the model 1911-A1 and stayed that way until they adopted, I think officially it was like 1985 or 86, they adopted the Beretta 92FS, which is known in the military as the M9 pistol. In that period of time, the United States government took delivery of 2.7 million of these handguns in that time period. They say they're still used in limited quantities by special units and that to this day, so it's still it's not the official service pistol, but I guess they're still around with some units even now. So, the usage of this pistol. My personal experience, I met a guy that was a World War I vet that was issued one of these. And what he told me, it was the slickest gun there ever was. Brand new, modern. He goes, you could take it all apart with no tools. Had 7 shots as fast as you could pull the trigger. And then you would just press this button here, drop out the mag, and stick another 7 shots in as fast as you can. Way better than a revolver. He was in a band in the Army. He was a musician. And when the war started, they made him a stretcher bearer. So he said he was up on the front lines in the trenches as a stretcher bearer, and that's what they issued him, was a .45 automatic. So he wore a pistol on a belt, and he carried wounded men off the battlefield. That was his job. He was tasked also in the lull. If you ever see in the old pictures, they used to have these food carts or whatever, where they would have warm food, and they would bring, with a horse, would draw this cart like a mobile kitchen up to the front lines and feed the men a hot meal. He said when there was no action and things were quiet, him and his partner would be sent to go get the food truck and walk alongside of it with their pistols drawn, ready to, I guess, to shoot any hungry Germans that showed up. So that was about his main use of the gun. He never mentioned about shooting it at anyone or anything. So that was it. But he was impressed, said it was a modern piece of technology and the coolest thing that he ever seen in terms of firearms back in 1918. So, like I said, they changed it a little in the 20s. Colt did sell some civilian versions of its military weapons, both the BARs, the Colt Monitor, and the pistol, the 1911 pistol. They're quite rare, and actually I've seen a couple examples. I know some people that had commercial models that were made in the 20s or 30s, but they were really never used by law enforcement in the interwar period. Gangsters and criminals loved them. I think Bonnie and Clyde had them. Machine Gun Kelly, all of them. This was this was used mainly by a lot of what they called at the time motorized bandits. Loved this gun. And I think the reason a lot of police departments, you have to remember at that time also, the 32 long was like the standard back in the early part, prior to World War I, of police, or maybe 38 specials were coming on the scene. But still, revolvers and these rural police or highway patrolmen and sheriffs, when they met up with some criminals with these 45s, you know, they were outgunned. Okay, then when World War II started, there were several companies brought in and contracted to make these pistols. Remington Rand, Union Switch and Signal, Singer Sewing Machine, which is the rarest variation of the World War II issue guns, Colt, of course, and I believe Ithaca Firearms also made this pistol. I do not know anybody, because see, another thing, the strange thing is, instead of issuing you a pistol, a lot of people were issued an M1 carbine instead of the handgun. And most of the people I knew that was in the service, a other than on guard duty or something like I carried it when I was in the service. They didn't really bring the gun into combat with them. If they had a need or had a job where a pistol used to be issued, usually they were given an M1 carbine. So I know people had them. I know there's probably stories, but I've personally never met someone that ever used the gun in actual combat in World War II. And of course, Korea was a rerun of World War II, and all the U.S. weapons were used then. So the gun was there, and I really don't know anybody that was in the Korean War. But we fast forward it to Vietnam, and I knew two guys that were in infantry units and issued the pistol. One was in there quite early in 1965, and he was the guy that carried the M19 grenade launcher, the 40 millimeter grenade launcher. And he was given a 45 also. And he told me it was hot, it was nasty in Vietnam, it was like 120 degrees. And he goes, I had the grenade launcher. He goes, so he left his 45 in his foot locker and carried extra canteen of water in its place. Next guy I knew that was issued one was M60 gunner. They told me he had to carry a 45. And he told me the same things. 1968, 69, he was there at the height of the war. He goes, I had no use for it. I had the machine gun. And he goes, they had to carry so many weapons out in the field. So he gave his pistol to someone else to carry and replaced it with another canteen of water on his belt. So the tropics and a lot of the stories I heard out of Nam, some personal stories, these things got rusted up quick, and really didn't hear much use of the pistol other than like tunnel rats or extreme close quarter combat. So the pistol was kind of losing its combat type of thing. You do hear stories of people using the gun. Okay, but I just never run into anyone that has. Now we fast forward it to the 1980s, shortly before it was retired, is when I joined the Navy, the only weapon they familiarized you with in boot camp was this gun. And they gave you a class, told you how it worked, all this other stuff. And the only thing we did with an actual 45 caliber pistol is, I remember this, and this is one of the first things I was frightened with when I was in the military. They gave us a lecture on the gun, and I believe the gun was like this. I'm trying to remember back 36 years ago. And they had, actual 45 caliber pistols. They had the gun on a bench. There was an area where you went, and they had one magazine in a little box. You were told to do this, to go, pick up the gun, I think hit the slide release, let the slide go forward, put the magazine in, pull the slide back, lock the slide back, take the magazine out, set the gun back down. That was it. So, we went to the bench, and before we went there, the man held up the magazine, the gunner's mate, and said, this magazine, there's a thing that sticks out. He goes, here. This goes to the front and forward when you pick the gun up and place it in there. So I went to the bench. I pick up the pistol. I guess now I'm thinking that's drop the slide back. Place the magazine. It's hard for me to do now, but place the magazine in the pistol. Pull the slide back. Drop the mag out. Set the gun back down. I passed. Now, this is one of the first times in the military that I was truly frightened, because down on the end of the bench there was an individual with a gun like this, the magazine like this, and literally beating the gun on the wooden bench to try to get the magazine into it. So obviously he didn't quite understand the concept. And then later on we were taken to an indoor range, and we fired so many rounds with a 40, pistols with the 22 adapter, the Colt Ace adapter. We fired 22s. I forget how many rounds we fired. If you hit the target at all, you were considered qualified, certified in the U.S. Navy, and out in the fleet you go, ready to be issued your 45. So that was about it for me. But we did, when I was on the ship, they did run us all through, and we had to qualify firing the gun in the 45 caliber at a silhouette target. And I forget, you shot 40 rounds, and if 32 of them were in the target, the life-size target, then you were considered certified and safe to be issued the gun. Not a marksmanship thing or anything like that. Then if you were lucky, every now and then they'd run qualifications and take us out and let us actually shoot a target to get. In the Navy, you're given a marksmanship medal, an actual medal with a ribbon, not a badge like in the Army or the Marine Corps. You get expert or whatever. In the Navy, you get an actual medal as a pistol marksman or sharpshooter. So that's all the stories I have about it. Now let's go on. Before the internet and before the mass media, you heard a lot of stories about these guns. And this one, of course, being the one. And you have to remember, in World War II, just about every able-bodied man towards the end of the war was drafted into service. We mobilized millions and millions of men. And a lot of guys that were drafted in that really didn't know much about guns. My grandfather was a baker. He had a 30-30 lever action gun and I think a single shot 12 gauge shotgun or something. And he hunted birds and deer, but never handgun. So a lot of these people pressed into service. I think it was less than 3 months you were on the front lines from being a civilian. And you had all kinds of neat stuff, machine guns, pistols, the whole 9 yards. So you get a lot of the tall tales of this gun and what was said about it. And like I said, years ago, back in the 70s, you just hear stories about this, that the gun back in the old days was considered reliable, would function no matter what. If you dropped it in mud, whatever, the gun would go off. I'm going to say that's true, but okay, we're going to get into the manufacturing end of it here. The gun was reliable and will go off no matter what. It is true. It took a man that was extremely strong to control this weapon and shoot it accurately, and the only way to get any accuracy out of it was you had to be like Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's kind of not true, and it's going to go back to a manufacturing deal here where that kind of came from. People didn't really talk much about the accuracy. They talked more about the reliability and the power of the gun. The gun actually, as is, in its size, made out of metal, is not that terrible to control. My wife can control it fairly well, and it's not that terrible of a gun to shoot. Some polymer frame guns that are more compact are actually more difficult to control and shoot than this weapon here. Stories about the 45 would stop anything. One guy told me if you had this pistol and hit a man in his hand, it would knock him off his feet. Don't know about that. Could be true, could not be true. Then I heard you only loaded 5 rounds in the magazine because if you put more than that, the full mag, you'd overheat the gun and affect the accuracy of the weapon. That's kind of not true, but in the Navy, when you're on the quarterdeck and issued this gun, the gun would be in a holster with no magazine in it. You'd have a guard belt on, and you'd have a 2-cell canvas magazine pouch with 2 magazines that did have 5 rounds in each. Now, why the Navy issued you just with 10 rounds that were supposed to stay in your belt and not go in the gun. And God forbid if you went back after your watch and didn't have 10 rounds, when you turned the gun into the armory, they'd go nuts. That's the way we carry it on the ship in peacetime. Okay, you got to remember, this is in port in the United States in peacetime. That was a standard thing. And that guy was a Navy guy, so I think he got a little confused on why they put the 5 rounds in the mag. The gun's accuracy will not get thrown off. You really couldn't overheat it running a couple mags through it. It gets hot, but not to that point. When it came to manufacturing these, I know people that manufacture them. And the thing about these guns and the manufacturing of weapons during the war, I've talked to people that worked in different factories doing that. There are tolerances to the gun. And there were some pistols that they actually made the frame and lower part of the pistol in one place and the upper part come from another. It was an Ithaca or something. And I had a friend that had one of these original military pistols. I remember he bought it. It was worth all this money and all this. But when you tried to shoot that gun, I mean, it was horrible. And how all these stories kind of culminate is this. We have to look at how the gun works, okay? And do you ever see somebody tell you, like, you know, like the gun's in this to do the rattle test? Well, that comes from the way the guns were manufactured back during the war. We'll take a look at a diagram, a cutaway diagram, and I'll explain all of this and kind of dispel some of the myths. Okay, we got a diagram here. And now we're going to talk about the manufacturing techniques and where this rattle test and a lot of these stories of reliability and accuracy come in. The way this pistol works is when it recoils, you see this lug here, this swinging link. It is in the closed battery position. When you fire the pistol, it'll recoil, and then this link slowly turns and drops the barrel from where it locks up here into the slide. These two little lugs up in here is what locks in the slide. I'll show you with the actual gun. Okay, there are your lugs up here. And this coincides with the 2 grooves in the slide here. Now what happened during the war, and this is what determines the accuracy of the gun, is as this barrel actually tips downwards when it swings on the link and then goes back up, you see it's raised up. The alignment of this barrel in the slide, where it locks into the lugs and all of that, determines the accuracy of this gun. The tighter the fit between this rail here, the rails inside the slide here, these grooves which this rides on, okay, also determines where the tighter the tolerance in that, the closer the fit, the less movement and play you have. Now during the war, like in 1944 and that, all these little components and that were being made in separate little companies. There's a place called Waterbury's, and my grandmother actually ran a milling machine where what she did is there were square blocks with a hole in them, and there were a dozen on there. She put it in a mill and she would cut this little notch here, just rough cut it on these blocks. And all day long, that's all she did was take these blocks, cut this notch, and then stack them all there. And they went to the next machine. There was another cut, and then in the end, after going through these different steps and processes, supposedly you had a finished part. Now, a lot of the machinists told me they deliberately would run this out of tolerance, different things. Now why? Why? Because then when when all these parts were brought together and assembled, they would fit together, okay, quickly. They were run out of spec, but not way out of spec. Just enough to go maybe to the far end of the tolerance, like 5 thousandths more or something. And it made the assembly easier. The gun did function. But the only problem is I have fired one of these World War II made pistols where you get this slop and movement. In this barrel, see also in the frame how the barrel fits. The side-to-side play is very minimal. Okay, if you open this up, say 5 thousandths on the barrel, 5 thousandths on the frame, then you'd have 20 thousandths of play. The parts are still within tolerance, but you get what's called a tolerance buildup, which is, you know, in a time of war, they just had to get these guns made quick and make sure they fit together and go off and send them out. They didn't give a crap about accuracy or anything else. So this is where, when you catch these pistols made at one point in the war, they will rattle. Like, you know, you see people take the gun, we'll back this up a little, and do like a rattle test, you know, see if it rattles side to side. And what you're looking for is play side to side, which this one has a little, and play up and down, okay, which there is none. So this gun's fairly tight, but I have seen examples that do rattle, okay, and when you fire this gun, because the slide is moving side to side on the frame and cocking, the barrel is loose in here and not quite locking up, and what happens is there is a misalignment. In other words, the way this locks up in here, like you see, will shift. The center of this shifts. So in other words, your barrel is twisted one way, the other way, up, down, this and that. And you cannot hit. I mean, and it's wildly inaccurate. I fired an example that at 10 yards, I was hitting the ground one shot in front of me. One was going high to the left, to the right, and I'm talking not inches, I'm talking off in feet. Okay? But because of this wartime production, this is where the gun, it's true to say that gun will function no matter what. You can drop the pistol loose like that in a bucket of wet cement, shake it off, and it'll still fire. Okay, you just won't hit nothing, but the gun will fire. So that weird, legendary thing that the guns will function no matter what comes from those pistols and that experience back in World War II, or how long these guns were in service. Now, the other thing where you had to be a Herculean strongman, and that I believe using that in this context, you have one pistol that is made loosely and doesn't shoot accurately, but yet another man has the same pistol that may be older or just a little tighter, and he can shoot this gun deadly accurate. Well, this is where the confusion, the stories, and the nonsense comes, and you know, that's what makes all these weird stories. During the war, the guns were made very loosely. They functioned, but they're inaccurate. Okay, if you get an old World War II example, you may find that. And a lot of people said that when they were later on in years, like in Vietnam or Korea, when they were issued one of these guns, really the accuracy, they're useless, okay? And that's why you kind of get an attitude about that, you know, where people, like the guys, would rather have another canteen than carry this damn pistol. All right? So that is true. And now there was a whole bunch in the 50s, 60s, how to get these guns, because the government did sell these pistols through the DCM, Director of Civilian Marksmanship, which is now the CMP, Civilian Marksmanship Program. But you used to be able to buy the older guns, and like I said, a lot of them were the old M1911s. They were probably worn out, and just that's why the government sold them. They sold the older guns off as surplus. So those problems wouldn't be there. But some of the guns, probably because they seen that they rattled and that and weren't of the best quality or technically to specifications, they would sell them. So a lot of these guns would come out, and then the aftermarket or pistol smithing craze started. And if you went to the gun magazines, they'd show you how to accurize one of these guns, how to tighten up the slide. Okay, there's all these little gunsmithing tricks. And it used to be, it was all garage gunsmithing back then. Okay, and a lot of these guys went on to be pistol smiths and you learn this over time, little tricks to make it accurate. One thing was replacing that link here in the barrel. You know, you could get different size links to help when that goes into its position to jack this up tighter into the slide. Also, there were tricks, you know, where one of them was prick punch and peening these rails on the frame, and that to more or less make the metal come up and grip more, to take that slop out. There was all kinds of techniques to you know, try to repair these guns and turn them into a target pistol. Okay, is basically that's what they're used for, and that includes also changing the sights and everything else. But that's where a lot of the confusion, the myths, the mystery, and all this other stuff comes. And if you're buying a modern reproduction, something that was made in the last 10 years, even 20 years, okay, like this gun, it's not, there's going to be no rattle, okay, at all. So that's not something to worry about. If you have an older gun from World War II or something, it may be something to look into, but that's when people talk about this particular gun, that's what they're looking at. So that's my deal on the history and the manufacturing and a lot of the myths, or some of the myths. There's more. I forgot half of them, all the crazy stories I heard about these guns over the years. But that's where a lot of that strange stuff will come from. Like the one guy was reviewing the gun, says, I'll give it the rattle test. Well, they shouldn't rattle. The amount of play in the guns should be very little on a more modern made gun. But that's my take on it. And now we're going to go on to review some more of these pistols.